So I've touched on this a bit about how it bugs me that if it's cool to hate on a wrestler, people will put everything they say under a microscope. Like any little thing they say, they try and find the smallest detail, smallest lie. But if they like you, they kind of just, they brush it aside. They don't really care. I've talked about this with, wrestlers speaking to the media or even with like how they're viewed after their drug use. We've touched on this before. Um, so on Twitter the other day, it was revealed, shocker, Hulk Hogan's a liar.
Whoa,
Not gonna deny it. I
brother.
mean, there's quite a few things that he's outwardly lied about. There's quite a few that he stretched the truth on. The big three that Twitter really gravitated to. He said he was going to be the bassist for Metallica. Clearly a lie. Not gonna deny that one. He said he was almost killed in Puerto Rico a few months before Bruiser Brody. I'm not gonna say that's a lie because the Puerto Rican people really tried to kill wrestlers who were mean to their hometown heroes. And I mean, so there's a chance. I don't think it was 4 months before Brody. I just think at one point Hogan was probably there, probably did something to Carlos Colon, and fan tried to stab him. But that was that was commonplace. Or even if it was someone backstage, clearly commonplace. This next one though, he talked about Brock Lesnar and how supposedly watched him when he was in high school, saw him come out of the UFC, and he was the first one that got to face Brock. Clearly, some things got mixed up there. I don't think Hogan cares about UFC. I don't think he cares about the NCAA. He clearly was saying Brock went from high school to NCAA. Then he showed up in WWE. Yes, he said he scouted him. I don't think he directly scouted him, as everyone says. I think he saw him at a match or two, saw this big beefy guy, and he's like, this is how I can be Hulk Hogan again. Because Hogan always beat the biggest, the baddest. Yes, Hogan was signed to WCW when Brock was getting scouted. That doesn't mean he can't go to a Minnesota show. I mean, at the time, LOD was still alive. Kurt Hennig, Rick Rude, Brad Ragans. He had a lot of friends. Um, but then, people really gravitate toward, he said, after UFC. You read his thing, he talked about how Brock was rough with him, squeezed his head hard, squeezed his back hard. It was that match in '02 they had when, beforehand, Paul Heyman told Brock, this is Hulk Hogan, you're not going to be able to manhandle him, and he did just that. Doing some research, I found out, I guess they're supposed to face at Survivor Series later that year, which, if that's the case, that would have meant it would have been for the title, because Brock would have already won the Undisputed title, but irregardless, they're supposed to face each other again, but Hogan wanted to go over, so they scratched it. Just think about this. After Brock has beaten The Rock and he's beaten Undertaker, Hogan's the man who stops him. Which I guess isn't as... I mean, Big Show beat him there, so... But Heyman also turned on him, so... But the point of all this story is I was trying to be like, Hogan's old man. He's probably getting things confused. Someone said, oh, Hogan said he discovered Undertaker. So I looked a little bit into that. They were on the set of Suburban Commando together. Hogan said he told Taker in passing, you need to meet Vince McMahon. And then, that's where Hogan claims he got him into the company. One, I don't think Hogan knew what WCW was at the time. And I don't think he cared. So I don't think he knew that this big, almost 7-foot man was a wrestler. And he wanted someone else to beat. Two, he showed up in the WWE locker room like 2 months later. Of course Hogan's going to think he did that. Do you think anyone's going to go to Hogan and be like, hey, we have this new guy coming in. He's going to be an Undertaker gimmick. Okay, brother. No, he just showed up and he's like, you're the guy. But anyway, I decided to, on Twitter, because I've had something brewing since before we went to WrestleCon, before we went to Really Cool Con.
I've heard about this for months.
Sergeant Slaughter claims that he discovered Undertaker. Like, he brought him to WWE. There's so much wrong with this. I was good. He's going to be at WrestleCon, but he's going to be at Really Cool Con. I respect the guy who ran Really Cool Con. I didn't want to say anything bad. I didn't want to tweet anything, Facebook anything. But I decided to say on Twitter, I mean, I think you have the tweets there if you want to read from there.
So yeah, Logan is arguing on Twitter with some guys about the Hulk Hogan Brock Lesnar thing, and then as soon as I started seeing him tweeting this out, like I can kind of see the writing on the wall that, especially from my position, you knew that he had this beef with
Well,
Sarge.
it was locked and loaded.
It was locked and loaded. He was ready to tweet this out. He said, "If you want to be mad at anyone saying they quote unquote discovered Undertaker, get mad at Sergeant Slaughter, who actually made the claim he found Taker in a box of tapes, even though it has been reported that Heyman Hustle and Bruce Pritchard helped bring him in." And I was really confused at first because Sergeant Slaughter he just retweeted it and like nothing else. He tweeted that out at 5:30 Eastern time. He just retweeted, and Sarge did not reply until almost an hour later at 6:30 p.m. from North Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. It's really very simple. At PW Proverbs, shoulder shrug emoji. Ask hashtag JJ Dillon, and at Vince McMahon. Who it was that brought a VHS tape of Mark Calloway to Vince's office. Shoulder shrug emoji. Ask Mark who called and invited him to a WWE TV event in Rochester, New York for a tryout. Shoulder shrug emoji. Ask Vince who introduced them there. Another shoulder shrug emoji. That's 4 shoulder shrug emojis.
I will say, I know that Vince has always, there's always been a thing where he's getting his old wrestlers ready to be like producers, writers, agents.
Yeah.
So do I think there's a chance he called Mark and was like, hey, this is where we need you? Oh, 100%. I think there's a chance that he's the guy that walked up and is like, Vince, this is Mark Calloway. Yeah, 100%. Do I think he discovered him in this? I have the article here before you go to the next tweet. And this stems from Slaughter being upset he wasn't invited to Undertaker's retirement ceremony. He said, I just feel like, I found Mark Calloway in a box of tapes. As a lot of people know, my back was hurt. I had to work in the office. One of my jobs was to go through this wannabe office. I had all these tapes and boxes and envelopes and pictures and letters from wannabe wrestlers and managers and valets and announcers. They wanted me to go through all these things. Just one was Mark Calloway, and I brought him in. I said to Vince, you gotta see this guy. I said, he's a wrestler, he's down in WCW, and he's got short red hair, but man, what a talent. He said, well, I've never heard of him, so bring him in. Alright. So the fact that he said Mark Calloway was a wannabe wrestler, you have to remember, before he came to WWE, he had a few years in WCW. He was a replacement in the Skyscrapers tag team. I believe it was him and Dan Spivey. He replaced Sid Vicious. I could have the flipping wrong there. He had main event matches against Sting. He went for titles. He had Paulie Dangerously managing him at the end of his run. He wasn't a wannabe. This was someone that was actually being looked at. He had quite a career even up to that point in the South. Like, that was my first red flag when seeing all this was, oh, he's a wannabe. And then I started to think. I was like, I'm pretty sure it was Pritchard and Heyman. And I can't find a absolute source. I can't tell if it was all Bruce Pritchard because he knew about him from, like, the Texas area.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it was Paulie Dangerously calling the WWE because he had Paul used to do like photography, so he had some connections. He had connections everywhere. Paul Heyman's probably the smartest man the business has ever had. I don't know if he called and was like, hey, take a look at this guy, sign him. I also saw that Taker had Hogan, Paul Heyman, and Bruce Pritchard all trying to get him meetings with Vince. I've never seen anything about Sergeant Slaughter. But if you want to go to the next tweet, I can explain even further why it wasn't Sergeant Slaughter.
Logan, a tweet, not to drag Bruce Pritchard into this again, but it's just so happened one day I get a call. I'm sorry. This is a quote. Quote, it just so happened one day I get a phone call from Paul Heyman, who was managing Mark in WCW, and asked me if there was any interest that his contract was coming up. WCW wanted to know if there was any interest in New York. Bruce then convinced Vince to give Taker a chance after a bad performance with Luger due to injury. We got Taker and Vince together, and Vince fell in love with them. Just personality wise, it was just timing.
Yeah, so it was essentially a, I wouldn't call it a tryout match as much as they did, but they sent someone to WCW to watch Calloway and Luger, and I think it was Luger was hurt, so it was a poor match. I mean, Lex Luger was a hell of a performer until he started getting injuries, and then he started to dwindle down. Um, so there's that, and that's from Something to Wrestle With. And a lot of times, for those that don't listen, Bruce Pritchard's really good about calling himself out if something's wrong or really explaining when someone else is wrong. You want to go to the next tweet now?
I'm also curious when you discovered him in the box of tapes. You said it was when your back was hurt, but you requested to come back in '90 after Mania 6. It was not taken off TV until June of '92. The last televised match was October of '92. The Undertaker debuted in WWF in October of '90.
Yeah. So, Slaughter, big person in the WWF for a lot of years, left, went to the AWA. I think he might have had a cup of coffee in the NWA. That might have been before, but either way, he saw the Hogan and Warrior and how big that was, and like everyone else, they wanted to come back. They knew that this really, the boom wasn't ending. Like a lot of people, after WrestleMania 1, they're like, oh, this is going to end. Then 2 happened, and they filmed it in 3 arenas. Then 3 happened, and it was quite possibly the biggest match in wrestling history. Then 4 happened with the tournament. Then you had Hogan Savage and Hogan and Warrior. This wasn't ending. He wanted to come back. And that's when the story where McMahon wanted to be heel, and Slaughter's like, oh, I don't know. I was really in the Marines. I don't know. And Vince is like, no, this will be good. Just work with it. He was a heel. Won the title, if you remember, in the Royal Rumble at Royal Rumble 91. Beat Warrior. Then Warrior and Savage got to go fight. And he dropped it to Hogan at the following Mania 7. After dropping it to Hogan, they did the SummerSlam match where Hogan and Warrior beat Slaughter, Adnan, and Mustafa. After that is when Slaughter did his whole I want my country back. He helped Jim Duggan. I feuded with the 2 guys he was with before. Then he was taken off TV, like I said, June of '92. He worked some shows against the Mountie. Then he had his last regular match against Nails. And again, this was commonplace for Vince and the old guys. He would have them show up to house shows because even though he didn't need them on TV because he was building the new talent, it would still get people to come to the shows. He did it with Bruno, did it with Slaughter, and especially in the area. A big one is Dick the Bruiser. He would have him in the Illinois area because he was so popular there. It made sense. Funnily enough, he started appearing as an on-air official from '92 to '94. So, if you're saying it's when your back was hurt, you wrestled throughout '90. Like, when you came back, you were there. As I said, when did Taker debut?
Undertaker debuted in October of '90.
October of '90. So he was still wrestling, like, I wouldn't say full time, but Slaughter was still there. It didn't happen. Like, there's no way. There's never once until this fabricated story came out that said Slaughter had a hand in it. I've never seen Slaughter having a hand in the signing or scouting of anyone. Slaughter was a stooge akin to Gerald Briscoe. But the difference was Briscoe could train people. He was such a good wrestler. Pat Patterson had a mind for the business. Slaughter was just kind of there. There's no way this is true. And like I said, I don't know if it's him being old. I don't know if because he was like, oh, Vince, this is Mark Calloway. If he's taking credit for that. Maybe Bruce Pritchard had the day off so that he got to call Mark and be like, hey, come by the McMahon pool. Like there's no way.
Logan, you should probably be careful. His daughter might attack you on.
Oh yeah, and then I'll get fired like Lacey. But the thing about it is, I wouldn't have as much of a problem with it. But I've not seen people like call him out for it. Like I said, Hulk Hogan says he brought Taker in, and it's a whole shitstorm. Even though I could excuse Hogan, because like I said, he saw him in a movie set, saw this big random guy who talked to Vince. And then he shows up. Oh yeah, I did that. Cool, yep, that's me. Slaughter has this whole story, this whole narrative. Found him in a box of tapes. Was it one of the pay-per-views he was on, and you just had a WCW tape laying around? It's Taker. I think maybe that's the part that stings the most. Being a big Undertaker fan, and then hearing that you found this wannabe in a box of tapes. Because like I said, he was in the CWA, which was the Continental Wrestling Association, which was pretty big in the South. He wrestled. His first match was actually against Bruiser Brody in WCCW. There's just so much. There's just so much wrong with Slaughter's story. And then I noticed he responded the first time, but after I kind of laid out the facts for him, I haven't heard anything back.
He might be trying to get a hold of Vince or Taker to come in and.
I really was tempted to tag Taker in it and say, "Did he do this?"
He tagged Vince McMahon in his tweet,
and I'm sure Vince loved that. He's like, "Oh, the fucking Slaughter again."
I don't think Vince has his own login.
No, not anymore. Yeah, I find it funny that he's discrediting Paul Heyman, who, like I said, managed him at the end of his time at WCW. Always had connections to be like, hey, can you help this guy? He's not going anywhere. And Bruce Pritchard, who was big in the Texas area, kind of knew a lot of the people. And I forget, who was Undertaker's first manager? I know that they usually would pair you with someone that you know very well. Who was that? It wasn't Paul Bear. Oh, yeah, it was fucking Brother Love. Bruce Pritchard himself.
Ooh.
So, I mean, Sarge's daughter, the people that Sarge used to quote-unquote drill. If you hear this, and you want to, explain to me, this box of tapes, how you discovered Undertaker, let me know. And then I can let you know that you're just a liar. Like I did to Sarge on Twitter. And for those listening and you're like, oh, why are you going in on him like this? It's your fault, because you all went in on Hogan for just misspeaking and misremembering sometimes. And the difference is Hogan was at the top of the world. He could afford those world-class drugs. Of course his mind's messed up. Like I said on Twitter, this last interview of his was with Joe Rogan. You think they weren't on something? Slaughter just said it out of spite because he wasn't invited to the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, and Hogan's ego, he needs to be responsible for everything that's great somehow. That's just how his mind is warped. He needs to find a way for whatever's popular in the business, he's responsible for.
Here you go. I'll read the last quote from this Slaughter interview. I can't find where it's at, but a lot of people brought up this interview. If you're listening, Mark Calloway, I just want to ask you one thing. I found you in a box of tapes. Sergeant Slaughter found you in a box of tapes, and I called you 3 times because the first few times he hung up on me because he didn't believe it was me. Finally, I gave him the office number, and I said, ask for me when you call this number. He said, oh, it is you? I said, yeah, it's me. Guess who we didn't invite to his Hall of Fame? Me, Sergeant Slaughter, the guy that found him, the guy that brought him to Vince McMahon and said, "Here's the guy. This is your guy." Can you imagine not being invited? I should have been in the front row. I always kidded Mark. Over the years, I said, "Hey, Mark, how's it going?" Great. I said, every time I go to the mailbox, I expect to see a little percentage. And he said, "Oh, check's in the mail, Sarge. Check is in the mail." And, that gives you a little bit of a ha-ha for a while. But, boy, you don't invite someone that kind of brought you to where you are today, not even to your Hall of Fame. I mean, that was a slap in the face right there. And if you're listening to this, Mark Calloway, I don't understand. I really don't understand. So besides everything I said before, all the lies he had, if you listen to that last one, he brought him to Vince and said, "This is your guy." So Sergeant Slaughter was such a good scout, he dug through those tapes, and he found this guy, and this is your guy. He just knew this would be a future champion, this would be a future cornerstone of the business. I'm so glad we're out of the convention circuit right now, because Sergeant Slaughter's an idiot. There's a couple more things we could touch on, but I just want to focus on this. Oh my god. Yeah, just this whole interview. I don't think I'd read any of it besides the box of tapes.
I don't think there's probably anything else worth.
No, there's not, but it's just.
Poor Sarge.
Yep. Vince took his headset off and said, "Sarge, where'd you find this guy?" I said, "In a box of tapes." Send him to my office. Oh, so Slaughter brought him to New York and didn't tell Vince. Yeah, there's just a lot of red flags with this. I've said this before. I mean, I'm a big Ric Flair fan. Take what he says with a grain of salt. Clearly take Hogan, what he says with a grain of salt. Any old wrestler that, needs that little ego boost, take with a grain of salt.
Yep, they're all looking for an ego boost or a way to get back into the limelight here. Because they notice.
Yeah.
They know that their lines every year at their convention table just gets a little less full. It's a little shorter.
Yep.
And then you find a way to.
A little shorter, and what would make your line longer? Oh yeah, I discovered Undertaker. Let me tell you, wrong-o. But I got to wait for this. Glad I finally got to discuss it. You have any closing notes you want to talk about our good friend Bob Remus?
No. I think you said everything. Sarge.
Perfect.
I got nothing for you, Sarge.
Yeah, Sarge, you proved to us that you did it, and it wasn't just a phone call. I'll eat my words, but that's the difference. I'd eat mine. You'll never eat yours.